Hello there and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to have a look at a victim of the Spanish Inquisition. In fact, it's the very last victim, an unfortunate individual named Cayetano Ripoll, who now has the unenviable record as being the last person sentenced to death and executed by the Christian Church. So please stay with me and let's find out about the Spanish Inquisition and how Ripoll fell into their clutches. The Spanish Inquisition was one of the world's most fearsome organisations ever known to mankind. If you were in medieval Spain, the very words Spanish Inquisition were enough to shake you to the core. This church-led organisation brutally tortured, mutilated and executed people in some of the most barbaric ways known to man for around 350 years. So, before we look into Ripoll's heinous crimes, if indeed there were any, let's first take a look at the Spanish Inquisition, how and why it was formed, its methods of operation, and some of its main protagonists. For several centuries, the Spanish people had been battling against the Moors from North Africa right up until the late 15th century. Yet, the fight against the Moors kept the people of the Iberian Peninsula occupied and served to reinforce the people's Christian religion. The yearning for religious harmony grew stronger as Spain's reconquest of the Moors was almost fully accomplished by the end of the 15th century. Spain also had one of the largest Jewish populations by then in all of Europe, and they soon became a target. So, in the latter half of the 15th century, the newly crowned King Ferdinand II and his Queen Isabella of Spain held the opinion that Jews who had converted to Christianity, mainly to escape generations of anti-Semitism, were to blame for the corruption that was evident in the Spanish Catholic Church. These Jews who had converted to Christianity were known in Spain as conversos. Old, wealthy Christian families regarded these so-called conversos with great distrust. They were accused of pretty much all of the country's problems. Some of the many alleged crimes included poisoning people's water supply, kidnapping Christian children, and causing plague. The Spanish Muslim community, I'm afraid, didn't escape the persecution either. A crusade against Muslims was planned in Granada by the monarchy, and Ferdinand and Isabella were convinced that even trustworthy conversos may have been covertly following their old religion. Now, of course, this just wouldn't do. The royal couple also feared upsetting Christian people who sought a far harsher position against the conversos. Ferdinand believed that starting an inquisition to root out these heretics would be an excellent way to raise money for the planned crusade by taking the conversos' wealth through penance. Therefore, in order to purportedly battle heresy in Spain, the Spanish Inquisition was formed, and this was very much a judicial organisation. But, in actuality, it worked to strengthen the monarchy of the newly united Spanish country. However, it did this by employing infamously cruel and brutal methods. The monarchs established the Tribunal of Castile in 1478 to look into heresy among the conversos, with the help of cleric Thomas de Torquemada. The conversos' Catholic education was the initial emphasis of the effort. By 1480, Jews in Castile were forced into segregated ghettos away from Christians. Now, understandably, the conversos began to leave Spain in great numbers, desperate to escape the persecution. Around 20,000 conversos confessed to heresy in 1481, in an effort to avoid being tortured and killed. The Inquisition's inquisitors quickly became more ruthless and vindictive. They ordered supposed heretics to denounce other supposed heretics as part of their penance. By the year's end, hundreds of conversos had been executed by being burned at the stake. Once the Inquisition had been firmly established, inquisitors would travel from town to town, making their presence known with an aim to rooting out heretics and to give local townspeople a chance to confess to their heresy. Their attention was no longer just focused on the conversos, but to ordinary Catholics also. A beating or a pilgrimage was meted out to those who confessed. Individuals who had been charged with heresy had to give a testimony to the inquisitors. Torture and death would be the unavoidable consequences if the heretic refused to confess. Heretics were frequently the targets of unfounded allegations and were not permitted to confront their accusers or acquire legal assistance. If you wanted to get rid of your neighbour, denouncing them as a heretic stood a good chance of getting the job done. Some inquisitors used their power purely to gain riches for themselves. Count Alphonse seized and kept for himself the lands of the accused. Others, such as Count Raymond VII of Toulouse, were obvious sadists who enjoyed executing heretics so much that they even tortured and killed those that had admitted to their heresy. This, though, became a step too far. By 1482, Pope Sextus had had enough and declared that the Spanish Inquisition was too harsh, and he was concerned that conversos were being falsely convicted. He came to this conclusion after hearing the complaints of conversos who had fled to Rome. The Pope then set up a committee to run the Inquisition and nominated Thomas of Torquemada, a Castilian Dominican friar, as General Inquisitor. Torquemada proceeded to establish Inquisition tribunals all over Spain. To obtain confessions, torture was the method of choice and became routine practice. Before the torture, of course, the inquisitors would interrogate their suspect. Inquisitors were given advice manuals with instructions for interrogating suspected heretics. Now, you may be surprised to learn that there are great similarities between the Inquisitor's advice manual and modern-day guides for interrogations performed by police departments and intelligence agencies all across the world. For instance, the Inquisitor may want to frighten the subject at first. To achieve this, one of the methods the manual advises is for the Inquisitor to be sitting in the interrogation room with a sizable stack of paperwork in front of them for when the defendant walks into the room. The advice is to read the documents whilst the defendant is answering the questions. This will give the impression that the Inquisitor has far more information to hand than the defendant could ever imagine. And while the subject is responding to questions, it is also suggested that the Inquisitor occasionally shake their head as if they don't believe what they're hearing, worrying the defendant and putting them at further unease. Well, this is practically word for word what you would see in a modern day interrogation manual. As the Spanish Inquisition progressed, interrogators began using more elaborate forms of torture, such as the rack, the pulley and, wait for it, waterboarding. Now, the use of waterboarding is quite interesting. One or two governments in the West not so long ago were using waterboarding, and one in particular insisted that it was not torture at all. The Inquisition, however, saw it very differently. To them, it most definitely was torture. Well, after all, that's why they were using it. The rack, of course, was a very well-known torture method associated with the Inquisition. One or both ends of a wooden or metal frame had rollers with the subject's wrists and feet chained or tied to them. The subject's joints were stretched, frequently to the point of dislocation, as the tormentor moved the rollers with a handle to pull the chains or ropes in small increments. The accused's limbs and legs could be separated from their body if the tormentor kept turning the rollers. Often a confession was frequently obtained just by witnessing another person being brutally tortured on a rack. Those heretics who refused to confess were summarily burned at the stake. Heretics who had confessed were sentenced during a public event called the auto de fe. These were elaborate affairs attracting literally thousands of spectators. However, the Inquisition was occasionally resisted by the population. 2 inquisitors were killed in 1485. One was stabbed to death in a cathedral and the other was poisoned. Torquemada managed to apprehend the assassins, and as an act of retribution, 42 people were thought to be involved were burned at the stake. Torquemada went too far though when he started investigating Spain's own clergymen for possible heresy. By now, Pope Alexander VI's patience has gone. He acknowledged that Torquemada needed reining in. He forced Torquemada to share the reins of authority with 4 other clergymen. The Spanish Inquisition, which also occurred in Spain's territories abroad, lasted for more than 350 years, and during this time it carried out many executions. The total figure varies wildly from 30,000 to 300,000. The Spanish version of the Inquisition, though, was by far its darkest manifestation. Let's now have a look at some of the torture devices employed by the Inquisition, just so we can gain a sense of the brutality involved in getting a confession. For those of you that have a squeamish disposition, you may want to skip this bit. This is what is known as a Spanish tickler. Sounds fairly harmless, doesn't it? May even look like a tool a farmer might use. However, this instrument was used to tear flesh off the bone in any area of the body, predominantly the back, face, breasts and the chest. It was used while the prisoner was restrained on a rack. The benefit of using this over the skin stripping whip, another brutal implement, was that the incision could be carefully regulated to more accurately produce wounds to the desired areas of the body and control the depth of the lacerations. These are known as pincers or tongs. They were used in areas like the eyes, nose, nipples and sexual organs, and were used to strip and lacerate any portion of the body. They were usually used when red hot. The head crusher. I really think this needs no introduction, quite self-explanatory. Awful. These are some other devices used in the torture process. A crucial component of the tribunals and the last stage of the Inquisition process was the auto de fe. It included a Catholic Mass, prayers, a parade of those found guilty in front of the public, and the reading of their sentences. The auto de fe was used to hand down and administer the prisoners' sentences. This was a meticulously planned occasion. There would only be an auto de fe when the Inquisition authorities believed there were enough prisoners in a certain neighbourhood or city. Preparations usually started 1 month in advance. Ecclesiastical and governmental officials were present during the lengthy ritual, which was held in open spaces like plazas or esplanades, and could attract literally thousands of spectators. Prayers would be said throughout the night in or around the city's plaza, and the vigil would finish with Mass at dawn and a breakfast feast for all participants. The public penitence ceremony then started with a procession of inmates wearing ornate symbols and signs on their clothing and bodies. These were used to pinpoint the exact heresies committed by the defendants, whose identities, their trial verdict and subsequent sentence remained secret right up until the very end. The convicts were brought to a location known as the quemadero or burning site, which was occasionally placed outside the city walls. The sentences were then read aloud. Prisoners who had their charges dropped or whose sentences had been suspended would often collapse in relief, but those who had been found guilty would then receive their punishment. Physical punishment like whipping, torturing and stake burning are frequently shown in artistic renditions of the auto da fe. Now interestingly, for the audience members who were watching, the auto da fe served as a means of repentance as well, since they shared in the process of reconciliation and had the opportunity to face their sins and receive forgiveness from the church. So how did Cayetano Ripoll fall foul of the Inquisition? Well, during the Peninsular War, which was 1807 to 1814, Ripoll fought for Spain. He was though soon taken prisoner after being apprehended by the French troops. He was then transported to France. Whilst captive in France, he mingled with a group of Quakers and learned all about deism. In short order, he quickly converted to become a deist. Now deism, in its broadest sense, refers to what is sometimes called natural religion, which is the acceptance of a particular body of religious knowledge that is either innate in every human being or that can be learned through the application of reason, and, more importantly, the rejection of religious knowledge that is learned through either revelation or the teaching of any church. When he eventually made it back to Spain, he began spreading deism by using his authority as a schoolmaster. The Spanish Inquisition immediately accused him of being a deist and instructing his students in deism. Later, he was detained for over 2 years after being charged with heresy. An Inquisitor report stated that Ripoll did not believe in Jesus Christ, in the Trinity, in the incarnation of God the Son, in the Holy Eucharist, in the Virgin Mary. Ripoll did not fulfil his Easter duty and suggested that the children he was teaching need not bother making the sign of the cross. Even as late as the 1820s, these charges were extremely serious for Ripoll. Ripoll was also accused of failing to teach his followers the proper respect for the Catholic Church's sacraments, including the viaticum, which is given to pardon the dying so they may be raised into heaven and for the comfort of the sick. It was claimed that Ripoll believed that hearing Mass was not necessary to save one's soul from damnation. The clergy of the Spanish Inquisition demanded that Ripoll be executed by being burned at the stake for his rejection of the Catholic Church, but the civic authority decided to hang him instead. The Inquisition had by now become largely a thing of the past, and Ripoll's conviction and sentencing were roundly and widely denounced right across Europe. But, sadly for Ripoll, the Archbishop of Valencia was unmoved, and Cayetano Ripoll was executed on July the 26th, 1826. His body was allegedly put into a barrel, decorated with flames, and buried in unconsecrated land by church authorities, who were furious that he had not been burned at the stake. Other sources claim that the church authorities disposed of his body by stuffing it into a barrel, burning it, and then tossing the ashes into a river. As far as is known, Ripoll was the last person to be executed after receiving an act of punishment from a church authority, in this case for heresy. "I die reconciled to God and to men" were Ripoll's famous last words. After Ripoll, the Spanish Inquisition performed no more executions, and in 1834 the organisation as a whole was abolished. Yet the Mexican Inquisition, which was a spawn of the Spanish version, continued to operate, with the final auto da fe occurring in 1850. Well, on that sobering note, I would like to thank you for watching this video, and please hit the like button if you have found it enlightening, and do consider subscribing if you would like to see more content such as this. If you fancy a trip through the lives of other famous people and events, please click on one of the other productions shown above. Once again, thanks for watching, and I really hope to see you next time. Bye for now.